Well, just to pick up that last point, I'll start, if I may, by giving huge thanks to Emma, to Scott, to Ellie, and to all the team for organising today, which I hope everybody here has enjoyed as much as I have. My thanks also to everybody who's come here to join us in person today at LSC. We've had a bumper turnout, and indeed, our thanks to all those who've joined us online at home and have really made it a big community effort, showing the strength of our movement and the interest everybody has in coming together to discuss how best we can take our campaign forward in the days, the weeks, the months, and regrettably, in all likelihood, the years to come. It's terrific that you've all been here. Thank you. Now, we started this afternoon, we started this morning when Dominic Grieve, our co-president, reminded us that for the generation that his father and my father were part of, the European project was above all a peace project. And those of you who came to the AGM will remember Michael Heseltine making his valedictory speech and making exactly the same point. For them, a world in which there had been two wars in Europe in the space of 20 years was one that they were determined to put behind them and to build something different. And the success of the European project is that in the 80 years since, countries that had habitually gone to war together for centuries have built something enduring and prosperous and lasting. And in a sense, it will be the most incredible irony if Donald Trump, that friend of Mr. Nigel Farage, proves to be the great recruiting sergeant that drives the peoples of Europe together and even drives Britain back into the European community as a result of what he has tried to do this week. It is truly a moment of absolute shame that Donald Trump believes that he and Putin can negotiate over the head of the Ukrainian people, their president and their government, carve up Europe in a sort of Yalta type fashion and try and do something which they then cheerfully say that it's down to Europe to police and to referee and to see through on a sustainable basis without even, if you please, involving any of the countries of Europe in that dialogue. It is a truly appalling and ridiculous situation. And if you feel about that, as many of us do, I'm reminded by David Keyes that this time next week, we have the Ukraine March organized by the TUC, supported by EMUK, gathering at 12 noon in Holland Park with a rally at 1 p.m. also in Holland Park, where British people, all sorts of elements of British society can come together and show the strength of feeling on this subject, our commitment to Ukraine and our commitment to a peaceful future for them and for Europe as a whole. Now, we've heard at various points in the day misgivings being articulated about the lack of boldness on the part of our new Labour government. But I will say this, that at least on the issue of security, they do seem to be rather more forward-leaning. And I do think that we should congratulate them on their readiness and their willingness to take up the offer made by Ursula von der Leyen a year ago to revisit the security relationship between the UK and the EU. And it's clear that from the very moment of the reset speech that Starmer made at Blenheim last July, that this is something they are genuinely committed to doing. And I hope very much that when it comes to the summit that will take place in London on May the 19th, that more practical effect will be given to that. Oh, that they would be just a little braver on some of the wider issues that they are grappling with at the same time. At the moment, we hear from the government that their great priority is economic growth, and understandably so, because if they're going to tackle the appalling inheritance of crumbling public services and an economy that's ground almost to a halt, it's entirely right that they must give a great deal of prominence to economic growth. But you will have seen, as I have, in just the last couple of weeks that the forecasts for economic growth are getting worse almost by the day. And as we were reminded this morning, on the 26th of March, Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, is due to come back to Parliament and make another economic statement. And it's been clear from the word go that she was making life difficult for herself by allowing themselves to be manoeuvred by Jeremy Hunt into a situation where he essentially set the red lines for their reluctance to revisit tax or borrowing. They boxed themselves into a bit of a corner. But even bigger, by way of a self-imposed constraint, was their refusal to revisit the question of our economic relationship with the European single market. Because if you're not prepared to put up tax, and you're not prepared to put up borrowing, and you're not prepared to revisit the relationship with the European single market, how on earth are you going to achieve economic growth? It's basically impossible. Now, Mark English, in his admirable address to us this morning, reminded us that the OBR says that leaving the European single market has put a 4% dent in British economy, in the British GDP. That is quite an old forecast, and 2 or 3 similarly scaled forecasts have come since that put the figure at above 5, getting on towards 5.5% whole in GDP in just 5 years since we left. Now, I thought that Cameron and Osborne were bonkers at the time when they tried to convince everybody that the trouble was going to come within about 6 months of the vote to leave. I thought, no, the problem is going to be over a generation. But if you had told me that within 5 years of coming out of the single market, we would have blown a hole in our economy about to the tune of 100, maybe 125 billion a year, I simply wouldn't have believed you. This has been far, far worse than, in my view, Project Fear ever told people it was going to be. And given that the British Treasury takes 40% or so out of the economy in taxation, you can see that we have a hole in UK public finances each year in excess of £40 billion. And so the problems that Rachel Reeves is going to be tangling with on the 26th of March are £40 billion worse than they need be, simply as a result of our being outside the European single market. So you have to ask yourself, how much longer can they limp on adhering to these self-imposed rules that are making their task almost impossible? I do not envy Rachel Reeves the challenge that faces her. I don't think anybody envies her that challenge, but this was the folly of allowing Jeremy Hunt, who made those irresponsible cuts in national insurance, knowing perfectly well there wasn't a cat in hell's chance that he was going to be there to live with the consequences, and leaving it, frankly, as a scorched earth policy. And she and we, the British people, are picking up the pieces of that. Now, Emma, in setting out the strategy this morning that we have adopted, reminded us that we have to overcome 3 hurdles before we can achieve the objective which we all share of rejoining the EU. The first of those is that a UK government has to take the bold step of starting the process and applying for accession. The second is that the EU has to decide that on balance they want us. And the third thing is that the British public have got to give a convincing answer that they want this very much, and that when we knock on the door of Europe, we do so expressing the settled will of the British people, because they're not going to take us back if we are still divided down the middle and looking as if we just want to resume the in-out dramas of the past. And well, we were almost precisely divided down the middle when it was put to the vote in 2016. So we're going to have a much more convincing account as a nation than we did at that time. So the question is, why is Starmer so reluctant to start this ball rolling? And we know that His MPs overwhelmingly are pro-European. We know that his party members overwhelmingly are pro-European. We know the people who voted Labour at the election last year are overwhelmingly pro-European. Well, the answer to the question, why is he so reluctant, can be found in the opinion polls, but it's not the polls that often get mentioned. We know that when people are asked, do you think Brexit is working out well or working out badly, that at least 62% in every poll I've seen for a year or more say that it is working out badly. And on a good day, 12%, God knows who they are, seem to think that it's working out well. However, if you then ask people, well, would you like to reopen the question and renew the national debate over it? Sadly, people run for the hills. Only 18% want to reopen the issue. And that is the problem. And that's the thing that makes him so reluctant. If you then ask people, well, whatever you thought about that, if there were to be a referendum tomorrow, how would you vote? And about 56% say they would vote to go back in, 44% to stay out, if you disregard don't knows. And disregarding don't knows, particularly at this stage in a process, is an extraordinarily dangerous thing to do. So the challenge before us and before all who are committed to the pro-European cause is to shift those two figures. We've got to get that 18% figure far, far, far higher. It has to be the national will that we want to reopen the issue. And we've got to get that 56% a lot higher too. It would perhaps be a just about acceptable outcome at the end of a campaign, but it's a very, very, very rocky basis upon which to start. Because once a campaign gets going, don't forget, yes, we'll have plenty to say, but so will Farage and GB News and the Daily Mail, and we know their tactics. It will be lies, fantasies, imagination, and every sort of nonsense that you can imagine. So understandably, if Starmer's going to start the whole thing rolling, he wants to do so from a stronger position. So the question for us is, well, how are we going to go about doing this? What we do know is that about 20 to 25% of the public are committed into nationalists, progressives, and by instinct pro-European. And they can be counted pretty firmly and pretty reliably on the side come what may. A slightly smaller number than that, probably around about 20, low 20s%, are frankly beyond hope. They are Little Englander nationalists who are not going to be persuaded of the pro-European cause in any circumstances whatever. But a much bigger group than either of those is somewhere in between, more than 50%. They might have voted Remain, they might have voted Leave, they might have changed their mind, they might not. They might be interested, mostly they're not. And an awful lot of them are young people who didn't even get a vote at the time, and some of whom, depressingly, have absolutely no awareness of Brexit. My son is a second-year student in London. When I was talking to some of his housemates and they asked me what I did and I tried to explain, they had never heard of Brexit. They were dimly aware of the European Union. They had no idea Britain had ever been a member of it. And these are intelligent undergraduates. It's small wonder when one of the peers on the all-party group went into a primary school and addressed 11-year-olds, literally not one of them had ever heard of Brexit or of the fact that Britain had been in the European Union. It's just worth bearing in mind that if you were born after 1998, you didn't get to vote in the 2016 referendum. And by the time we get another referendum, which somebody erroneously referred to as a second referendum, by the time we get potentially to a third referendum, it's likely that nobody aged 35 or under will have been old enough to vote in the previous one. And so there is a huge job of education to be undertaken here. How are we going to reach those people, that 50+% who just don't feel very interested or turned on about the issue at all? Well, we are commissioning a huge poll. It's going into the field within the next 10 days or so, a 10,000 poll where we are trying to segment that 50% into slices where we can work out who they are, where they are, what the arguments are that will appeal to them, and what the issues are that matter to them and through which we can reach them. And that will then be, as it were, the route map for our communications and political strategy for the next few years. Because what we do know, and we heard a bit of this in the session that we've just had about campaigning with young people, is that if you want to reach people and communicate with them, you have to meet them where they are, not where you are. You have to address the things that matter to them, not the things that matter to you. So we have to find the ways of identifying those issues and those characteristics that will enable us to do that. It's a huge task. There are huge mass of people, but they're not one blob. There are lots and lots and lots of different segments. And so our strategy, if you like, in answer to a gentleman's question from earlier, our theory of change is that we will try to find them segment by segment, strand by strand, step by step, and try and engage them and get them to connect the dots and understand why it is that the things they care about have all been damaged or affected by the crazy decision to put a distance between ourselves and our European neighbours. And so it is that you can see over the last couple of years, we've engaged with scientists over the Horizon programme. We've engaged with musicians and performers in our Face the Music campaign. We engage with people in Northern Ireland over the issues on their border. We are engaging with students and young people about Erasmus. We heard from Caroline Lucas very powerfully earlier how we can engage with the environmental movement, because there are some absolutely shocking things there which surely provide a coincidence between European campaigning and green campaigning. There's more to be done with young people about the opportunities more broadly that are being taken away from them. There are things happening in the field of food regulation which ought to be worrying anybody, and businesses are at least willing now to talk to us. I mean, you heard from Joe Megan that they may not yet be being particularly brave in their public pronouncements, but they wouldn't even talk to us before the election. And there's been a marked change since, with business groups and businesses showing a far greater willingness to come and talk to us now, and to sponsor events and studies, and generally to begin to show a little bit of courage and to get their head out from under the stone. And so we have to try and take the Labour effort at a reset and grab the component parts of that and push them to go further and faster than they want to go. And we've got to reach these young people, these people who aren't really familiar with the agenda, don't understand what it is that has been stolen from them, and encourage them to imagine a different future where we are part of a community of friendly nations who share values. Because as Dominic said in his description of the changing world about us, you know, we can see what Russia's values are, we can see what China's values are. I'm sorry to tell you, we're beginning to see rather clearly what America's values are. And in a bit of a wild world where you don't quite know who your friends are, who is it who shares our values? The values that above all else put a value on freedom, democracy, human rights, peace through security, who want to take action together to tackle global challenges like climate change, global poverty, and migration. And the answer to that is that it is our friends and neighbours with whom we have a shared history and whom we have a shared culture and value system. And if we want to really act as a force for good in the world, we have to work with those friends and neighbours to make that happen. So our challenge is to get to the point where on all those three questions in the polls, do you think it's working out well? No. Do you want to reopen it? Yes. Will you vote to go back in? Yes, we will. We have to get to a position where the scores on all of those questions are so powerful and so strong that not only will Starmer begin at last to dare to think about it, but by the time, ideally, of the next election, we need to have gotten to a point where he doesn't dare not to think about it, because what we simply cannot afford is a second Labour term where they are still tied into these same ridiculous red lines with which they have imprisoned themselves in their first term. So if sometimes some of the things we ask you to do and some of the causes that we take up don't seem to you necessarily to be the highest priority or most understandable thing for us to be doing, please bear with us. There is method in our madness. We are trying to work our way around these various different segments and get them all thinking and talking about Europe in the way we do. And if some of these campaigns appeal more to you than others, that's fine. Please, we welcome voluntary effort. All of you are guardians of your own time and will do what you want with it. And if some of you prefer just to talk about Rejoin, then just talk about Rejoin. But we would really, really like you to join in this varied range and series of mini campaigns, because we think that we can achieve incremental victories, because we think we can grow momentum, and because we think that by taking a systematic sweep over a sustained period of time, we will reach more and more and more segments of our society. So that is our theory of change. And once we have harried and hassled and poked and provoked the government over reset, and have engaged with young people in particular about reimagining what the future could look like if there are opportunities to be part of the world's most democratic and most prosperous economy could be restored to them. And if we begin to rebuild our relationship with the different programs and agencies and activities of the European Union, then, having rebuilt and reimagined and reset, our ultimate goal, for which we all strive and which we would all love to see tomorrow, will finally come into view, and that is Rejoin. So please, thank you again for coming today and for supporting our campaigns. Please bear with us, join in the mini campaigns that we roll out before you, and together, step by step, strand by strand, segment by segment, and increment by increment, we will get to our final goal of rejoining the EU. Thank you very much for coming today.